Welcome to Straight from the Source with Hayley Watts. Our guest today, Sherri Papini. Sherri, you don't really need an introduction, but this is, in 9 years since you've been in the public eye, the first time that you've spoken with local media, media in general really lately. Why now? Why are you here today?
Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity to meet with you. I think first and foremost, I'm not intimidated in the same way that I used to be, and it's time for me to participate in a story that's ran about me, without me, for this long. And I think a lot of people have wanted to hear from me. A lot of people wanted those missing pieces that didn't make sense to make more sense, and to make sense of what happened.
So, when this all started back in 2016, I mean, can you just describe who you felt you were as just a woman, a mom, a wife who lives in Reading? What was your relationship with your community like?
Well, I was always doing community events. You know, every time we had like ducky derbies or asphalt cowboy events or anything like that, going to the pancake breakfasts on a regular basis. I feel like I was always pretty deeply involved with the community.
When you eventually made it back home and you saw what happened, I'm sure you saw news coverage in terms of like people who were looking for you and worried about you, and you saw some of the, the situation with your ex-husband, Keith, I know that's a different story, but I mean, what emotions does that kind of evoke for you when you saw that, all those people who cared about you and were worried about you?
Our community is incredible. You know, we've seen some really catastrophic events happen in our community, and we've continued to see people show up, and we've continued to see people give so much generosity to people that they've never even met. And when I was missing, our community came together in such a big way, and they did so many things, and they volunteered their time, which is everyone's greatest resource. And I think, you know, something that I've come to understand now very deeply is one of the worst things you can do to a person that cares about you is make them feel like their caring was in vain. And so I think a lot of people in our community gave so deeply, and I'm so grateful for that. It was so extraordinary. And in fact, their deep caring is one of the negotiation tactics that I used to get back home from captivity. And their strength meant so much to me. And, you know, when the story came out and everyone thought that it was just all a lie and I did it to myself, that deeply wounded a lot of people in our community. And I was in real danger, and being able to come out and tell the truth about what happened so they know that what they did wasn't in vain, and it was so deeply felt, and it actually helped the negotiation process to get back home. I think that a lot of people are missing that part. And I'm so grateful. I have so much gratitude for everything that our community did in support of when I was missing.
So going back to 2016, the day that you disappeared, I've heard little bits and pieces of that day described by investigators, by your ex-husband, and a little bit from you in different documentaries or podcasts, but is it still fuzzy to you exactly? You know, you left your house, right? You went out running. I have to tell you, I got my German Shepherd dog after hearing about that, because I run too, and I used to wear headphones. And but do you still feel like that there's kind of like a haziness in your memory, or do you remember being taken?
I have no memory of getting in the car. So I did make a plan to meet up with James, but there was no plan to go to Southern California. So I think in the film they did a really good job of demonstrating that there's one way or the other. You know, I think that it's plausible that I could have gotten in the car, and I also think that it's plausible that I didn't get in the car. If there was any memory of it, I would have certainly said, and I wish that there was. I wish that I could find that memory. I can tell you with certainty that there was no plan to go to Southern California. I can tell you with certainty on the way to Southern California, it was very apparent that I was drugged. So that kind of demonstrates that there's no permission. If you have to drug someone to take them somewhere, generally you don't have someone's permission, but I have no memory of getting in the car, and that makes that really difficult. And it's something that I wish that I had access to myself, because it would give me healing even.
Yeah. For people who haven't been listening to anything that you've come out with recently and heard your side of it, you are saying that you did have a relationship, right, with James Reyes, but it wasn't ever in person, and you had no plans to go anywhere with him, and you had intended to break it off. Was that where things stood?
That was the intention. Yeah, and that day on November 2nd in 2016, he was incredibly aggressive in the way that he was texting me. It was very different. So we'd already come in town. We'd had a plan actually to go to Cattleman's in public. There was no plan to go to Southern California, and my intention was to break things off. And in fact, when he was text messaging and very aggressive, I was trying to convince Keith to come home for lunch so that I would have the ability to say, James, I'm sorry, my husband's home, I can't meet up with you.
So if that was the case, though, so what if Keith had come home and you have this husband who you say you're also afraid of, but why invite him home when there's a possibility like, oh my gosh, what if James shows up?
He knew how afraid of Keith I was. So he knew if I would have texted him and said, he's home, I can't go, that meant that I couldn't go. So it was like trying to juggle both relationships, and that, I was deeply flawed back then. I was seeking a lot more external validation than internal validation, and I've come to have a different relationship with that now, and I know what I did wasn't right, and I wish that I had more courage to have left him way sooner.
You were saying that the texts that James was sending, they were getting to be pretty aggressive towards the end, right? And you were worried that he would try to sabotage your marriage. Did investigators ever, when they found those burner phones, did they ever address that? Did they ever ask you about that, or did it come up?
No. And in fact, they didn't find the burner phones. They found from my understanding, there was a connection to where the burner phones communication was lost. And I wish more than anything that they would have found them, because it would exonerate me, and the communication in them would have exonerated me, because it would have demonstrated what I said in text message, which was there was no intention to leave to Southern California.
Right.
And James has continued to say that there was a plan, but there is no proof that there was a plan. It's just his word against mine.
Do you have your phone still? Or
No.
what happened to it?
No. So the burner phones, I have no idea what
Oh.
happened to them. Law enforcement never found them either. Or maybe they did, and we just don't know.
But you had it at your house before you disappeared somewhere, and it just disappeared.
I took it on the run with me.
Got it.
So where it went from
I
there,
see.
I have no idea.
Okay. All right. That makes sense. What do you have to say about the whole controversy, I guess you could call it, over the placement of the iPod or whatever it was, your music device, and your, like, the strings of blonde hair? A lot of people were speculating, oh, it looks so strategically placed. I mean, do you have thoughts about that?
Yes, I do, actually. I wasn't the last person to be in contact with them. So there is quite a lot of concentration on that clue, right? There's a lot of things in the case where we have a lot of people that are deeply invested in the case, and so they want to find each little clue to make the case make sense, and that is in fact one of them. But what is missing is I don't believe I was the last person to touch that. So I can tell you the description of what happened. It's difficult to recall a 2-second interaction between pulling something out, the gummies with your hair that very easily pulls out into it, to where it was placed. But Keith was the last person to have contact with the phone before law enforcement arrived. So trying to get me to describe how it was placed and how it was laying, I can tell you how I laid it prior to their arrival, but we don't know if he touched it in any way. He can say that he didn't, but we don't know that for sure.
Right. Okay.
I've done my best recollection of it, and it's difficult because it's a 2-second engagement of a memory when I was in distress, and trying to remember it all this time when that's the fuzziest part of my memory as well.
Okay. How much of your story that when you were found and when you started talking to local law enforcement and the FBI, and you were describing the scenario that you were in, right, and the harm and the 2 Hispanic women, all of that, how much of that actually happened, and which parts were fabricated, if any?
The incidences and the mutilation to my body, all accurate, all true. I just simply said she or they instead of saying James. I was too afraid to say who he was. but the description of the room is very accurate. The injury is very accurate. Everything that I said aligns with every bit and every piece of the description of that. And in terms of, the sketches of the two women, they were very much people that were there. And I deeply regret how it blew up after that. Like, it was not my intention in any way to make this about race or cause any harm to our community or anyone in our community. And I have so much sorrow about that and so much regret about that. It was simply to keep me safe, and it was a way to try and lead them to him and giving some sort of clue to his identity. It was not in any way formulated to cause damage to any race or any person in our community at all. And I'm so sorry if it did in any way.
So something that I'm curious about is these terrible things, if they happen to you and these people who are responsible are still out there, go ahead.
Sorry.
Yeah, help yourself. Is there anything that you can do or you want to do moving forward? And there's a trash can right here.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I think that, historically, it's very difficult for victims to come forward. Mm-hmm. And my story is not any different than most victims of horrendous crimes. It takes a very long time for people to come forward. My circumstances are very different from most people, but it's quite normal for a victim of a crime to take quite a long time to come forward.
Well, that part makes sense, but in terms of just, like, how can you live with knowing that they're out there, these bad guys who did horrible things? When I say guys, men, women, anybody who knew about what was going on with you, and you're not trying to pursue any sort of
I am.
action against. Oh, you are.
I am. Yeah.
Okay.
I have a difficult relationship with law enforcement, especially because of my charge. Mm-hmm. So I've kind of been given a life sentence with my charge in terms of relying on testimony. And that makes it a difficult relationship with law enforcement.
Yeah.
But I am trying. And, there's real culpability in this crime. And it's one of the reasons, one of many, why I continue to come forward. Now I have the courage to be able to say I was having an emotional affair, and this is why I hid his identity. I'm not afraid anymore.
Yeah.
And I do wish that there was something that happened in terms of the people that had culpability in my crime.
You've told me a few things in terms of, like, your husband having a relationship with certain members of our local law enforcement and feeling at times maybe like the people who interviewed James were sort of feeding him questions that would kind of set him up to say something that would get him off the hook. Can you expand on that and tell me what your feelings are as to why things really shook out the way that they shook out?
So we've seen in the interrogation video that law enforcement, and even in my docuseries, you see the lead FBI agent say, yeah, I definitely would not have interrogated them in that way. They feed him. They say, if she wanted to go with you, then it's not a kidnapping. And if she wanted what happened to her, then there's no crime. So when you lead someone to give them the option to opt out of their culpability in the crime, that's kind of a flawed investigation, one would say. And it's pretty infuriating because James, he has a lot at stake coming forward and telling the truth. And I've paid for my crime. My entire life was taken away for my crime, and I feel like I continue to suffer and continue to pay for my crime. And he hasn't. He hasn't answered any of those questions honestly. And in fact, they say in the interrogation, we know that you've been lying, but we will make that go away if you then answer our questions. And that's quite concerning.
This may be the most obvious question, but we really haven't touched on it yet. In the very beginning, why not just tell them it was James?
Well, because what you're seeing I'm suffering right now is exactly what I was afraid of. It's not just the post-separation abuse that I'm suffering right now. Mm-hmm. It's when I was in captivity, James had continued to say, I'm watching you, I will be watching you. I've seen enough crime TV to know that every bit of your interrogation will be online. And so when I was interrogated by law enforcement, I had my husband sitting next to me who I could not come out and tell the truth about. And I had, every time there was a camera on me, I felt like I was looking right at James. I was just too afraid the entire time.
Afraid of James, and then also you're afraid of your ex-husband,
Yeah.
husband at the time. What was it about Keith that had you so fearful?
Well, Keith says in his interrogation, it's more important to him to figure out whether I was cheating on him. And when you think about your spouse, if they're being harmed by another individual and they are terrified of another individual, but what's more important to them is whether you are cheating on them, that would make someone very fearful of what you believe that they're capable of, which you're seeing that he's capable of. You know, he said that if I would have signed these unfair agreements, I could go home and I could be with my children.
This was after you got out of prison?
Before I went to serve my prison sentence, before I signed the plea agreement, Keith came to me and said if I signed more unfair agreements that I could go home and I could be with my children, but I had to give him complete control. I had to relinquish all control over my custodial rights, over my life rights, over my property rights, and if I did that, I could go home. And now he goes on the stand, and it's been broadcasted even in our last trial that he says that I'm suddenly a danger to my children and that I shouldn't be around my children because I've caused harm to my body, which it's very clear that I couldn't have possibly have done. I mean, I couldn't have branded my own back. I couldn't bite my own inner thigh. There are so many injuries that I couldn't possibly have done myself. He's just getting away with it because he's saying that I wanted it. And I'm telling you, there's no evidence to conclude that. Not at all.
Now, we're talking about James at this point, the one who harmed you.
Yes.
And James passed a polygraph test. So did you. What does that mean to you?
So I love that you asked me that, and this is such a rabbit hole to go down. So there's some flaws in polygraph examinations, but what my polygraph examination was able to conclude is that I have a response to something that demonstrates some kind of shame, right? So polygraphs don't really tell you how big of a lie, how little of a lie, if it is a lie. What they do is they show you that you have a physical response to a particular subject and a particular statement, in which I did. And I carry a lot of shame about what I believe I'm at fault for. You know, I had this emotional affair with James. I knew that he was coming to town, and there's things that I still carry a lot of shame about. And what you see is that I have emotions, and I have a demonstration of real emotions. People that have sociopathy they're void of that. They don't even have apathy. They're able to pass these polygraphs completely flawlessly because they have no attachment to any sort of emotion or demonstrate any remorse. So it would make sense why someone who suffers from sadistic acts and sexual sadism is also attached to a type of sociopathy that would lead one to flawlessly pass a polygraph examination.
And you would describe James as somebody who is a sociopath?
In my opinion, absolutely, yeah. I'm not a therapist, I'm not
Right.
a professional,
Right.
but
Yeah.
yes, absolutely, he's incredibly dangerous.
Now-
And you see him now, excuse me for
No, it's fine.
interrupting you, but you see him now, he lives a life in seclusion, and he's not, you know, an active member of his community. He's, you know, you see in the film, he's still harming animals and lives kind of in a depraved part of the country, and, you know, he hasn't changed.
Has he contacted you?
No,
And nobody in the family's contacted you or threatened you or nothing?
no.
How much do you think that the other family members, like these two Hispanic women, right? You said one was his mother, or your memory of what she looked like, and the other one was a family member who lived nearby, right?
Yeah.
I mean, do you have any idea what was going on? Like, why would this family get behind what was happening to you?
That's a great question for them.
Yeah.
You know, when they were interrogated, they said that they knew that I was there. They're just claiming that they didn't know what was going on behind closed doors.
Yeah.
But I know for a fact that they do. I mean, they saw me chained to a wall. They knew what was happening, and they saw my body afterwards.
Yeah.
They're just all relinquishing their
Right.
culpability in that
Well-
and backing off of it.
And when you talk about negotiating your release, I mean, that was just between you and James, right? There was like none of the women or cousins or anybody else who was involved had anything to do with it or helped like negotiate on your behalf?
Correct. Well, he had been talking during captivity. He talked about quite a lot of arguments that he was having. In fact, he even joked about his cousin who would regularly watch me, naming me America's Most Wanted. So it was like they all knew.
Yeah.
They all had some kind of communication about knowing.
You would think that they would be terrified. There was so much media coverage of this, and kidnapping is a gigantic crime.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it
Yeah.
didn't seem to you like they were afraid of getting caught or getting in trouble. You didn't hear anybody trying to convince him, like, hey, you've got to let her go, or
I wasn't-
worse.
Yeah, no, I wasn't privy to any of those conversations. They could have happened.
Mm-hmm.
By all intents and purposes, they could have certainly happened. I know that everybody was getting really anxious,
Yeah.
and that's what he continued to say. But he also said, I have friends in high places, and I have friends in law enforcement as well. And his family are a bunch of thugs. They don't have a good record, and neither does James. And now what you see is suddenly his record is wiped clean. And I've picked him up from jail when we were dating. I know that he has a record. I've seen him get into very violent altercations with people for which he, was put in handcuffs for. And now it's just suddenly gone.
And remind me how you and he started speaking again.
His brother died. So we had a little brother with quite a lot of health conditions, and my parents were contacted at their former business, and we sent condolences to the family. And, James is a predator, and what happened to me is preventable. And I was deeply vulnerable to his grooming process and to him being a predator. And, there are quite a lot of opinions out there about my past and my childhood trauma. And, there's this confirmation bias that I was a troubled teen that was very defiant and used to run away from home. And I think that that's just a connecting piece that allowed him to prey on me. I have a lot of friends and a lot of family members who have children that are deeply troubled because of trauma, that run away or are defiant or are struggling because of some kind of trauma. And those are the ones that get preyed on by serious predators. I have a girlfriend who was sex trafficked, in fact. She was hospitalized for attempting suicide, and that's how they got her in the most vulnerable state. And so we're relying on a confirmation bias that I had run away or that I was a troubled teen. And what they're missing is that it just made me incredibly vulnerable to a very dangerous predator.
Okay. Let's see. When I'm trying to think about your relationship with your ex-husband, Keith, going back to the deal he was trying to get you to sign. That wasn't the first time he had you sign some sort of paperwork and agreement, right? How did this all get started where he's trying to contractually bind you besides, the contract of marriage, of course?
Well, because he'd done it before and it worked.
How did that come up, and how did he get you to, it was a postnup agreement, right? I'd never even heard of that before I heard of this.
It's pretty rare. Postnuptial agreements are fairly rare. So, when we look at Keith's track record, he says one thing in police interrogations, he says another thing in his documentary, and he says another thing under oath on the stand. And so in police interrogations, he tells law enforcement that he had me sign the postnuptial agreement because I was speaking to other men, but in Keith's opinion, that means people that are not deemed worthy enough to me to have any engagement with. He was in complete control of my social circle and all of my friends, so if there was someone that was not acceptable to Keith Papini, it meant that I was not allowed to engage with them, and my defiance of that just meant that I was going to do it anyway. And that was where the secret life built. It was where the secrets started. And so when he had caught me having an engagement with someone that he didn't deem was appropriate, the postnuptial agreement came. And then when he gets on the stand and is sworn under oath in court via our transcripts that we have, he says it's because I was bad with money. So we have very conflicting stories from a man. So I don't exactly know why the postnuptial agreement was created, other than it's a demonstration of control.
And you felt like you had to sign it or else.
Oh, yeah. That means if I didn't sign it, our marriage was over.
Right.
And in a postnuptial agreement, generally you have dual representation. So you have one lawyer for the husband and one lawyer for the wife. And I didn't have that opportunity. I didn't get the ability to seek my own counsel and have someone else analyze the postnuptial agreement who would have seen that it was deeply flawed and very one-sided.
Was this all because you just loved him at the time and wanted the marriage to work, or did you feel some sort of fear? Like, why go forward? Why not say, hey, I should have an attorney?
Oh, I was a meek woman then. You know, I was suffering from a deep-rooted personality disorder of being a people pleaser and having self-defeating personality disorder. And I mean, I was really broken back then. I was deeply traumatized and severely broken and really believed him. When he said he was going to ruin my life, I believed it. I mean, you're seeing it now. I mean, this smear campaign, he built an entire film to destroy me.
Yeah.
So when he says something, I believe it, and I believed it.
He said some pretty extreme things in the film, that the Hulu one that came out first. And probably the most glaring one was something alleging that you intentionally made your kids feel sick, right? Like using alcohol around their neck in a bag or something like that. I mean, what can you tell me about the actuality of those circumstances?
Well, that, I think, is the most disturbing thing that he's done thus far. And frankly, what we see in family court is generally when you have some kind of a toxic relationship or a traumatic relationship, those are the types of folks that you see in family court. When it's an amicable breakup, it's a mature breakup, you don't see them in family court. They just kind of split and share custody. False allegations are quite common. And I didn't know that until I went through family court. And it's devastating. It devastates people's lives. And what you see in the documentary is we show the actual physical evidence and the proof that the report is concluded to be unfounded and it's closed. And when I tell you it's thoroughly investigated, it's Sherri Papini, so the name caught its attention when it was investigated. It was thoroughly investigated, not just
by Child Protective Services?
Layers and layers of not just Child Protective Services, but law enforcement as well looked into it. My children were investigated. My children were interviewed for it, which is deeply disturbing that you would even put my children through that.
Yeah.
And the lie itself, it doesn't make sense. And generally when things don't make sense, there's some kind of flaw there. So the narrative and the false narrative is that I forced my children to inhale rubbing alcohol to make them sick. But that in and of itself scientifically is flawed, because that would be like having someone use smelling salts, for example. It doesn't actually make you sick.
Yeah.
That's not something that I would ever do to my children. I primarily focused on natural remedies, which my children said in their interview, and I've never tried to make my children sick. There is no hospital visits or overly encouraging them to go to the doctor, and there was no evidence to conclude that that's accurate. It was just to defame and slander and just to hurt and harm me.
I think I heard you tell somebody that it was like a peppermint oil or something like that, and that's how your daughter described it, but she didn't really know what it was or something like that?
No, and the manner in which he uses my daughter, he went as far as trying to direct her in a film to get her to do something. It's so disturbing, and in my opinion, is borderline child abuse to involve your children to engage in a false allegation.
Yeah.
It's terrifying.
They're with him full time right now, right?
At the moment, yeah.
And you get to see them sometimes, at least weekly?
No, I see them once a month right now. Keith has every opportunity to allow me to see my children more. He's doing the absolute bare minimum, and even at the bare minimum, he's still not following the court orders. I mean, at the last trial, he gets on the stand and says that he's not going to follow court orders. It was really shocking. I mean, the judge even leaned over the podium and went, I'm watching you right now. So he just has no interest in following the rules.
What about your kids? When you see them, are they asking to be with you more? Does it seem like they are aware of this narrative? Or,
I don't know. I mean, when I'm with them, we're talking about school and boys and glitter and
so
sports
things are
and
good.
things.
Things are good.
Yeah.
Okay. It's not like you don't feel like their minds are being poisoned or whatnot with.
I just don't know right now.
Yeah.
You know, there's not enough time. There's not safe space for them to really discuss that. And I really don't,
Yeah.
I don't know.
You just focus on.
What my focus is to provide a safe environment for them to express themselves in whatever capacity they need to do that. I'm looking forward to having that reunification therapy where there's a professional present so that we can kind of unravel this alienation that's happening and get back to where we once were, because you know, after the abduction and after I came home, there was 6 years with my kids, 6 years where there was no reports of anything happening or anyone seeing any issues or anything happening, because I had a deeply close relationship with my children. And now it's complicated. Now there's supervised visitation, which when it's not being used the way that it should be used, it's really difficult on children.
Yeah.
And you know, I see these other cases of women that have caused real harm to their children get them back quicker than I have. You know, it's difficult to say. It would have been easier if I was just a drug addict. I would have my children back sooner.
It's pretty stunning the way that, yeah, go
Sorry,
ahead.
I'm
Of
sorry.
course. No, I mean, help yourself. People go missing a lot, right? This is not the first time that we've heard of this happen. It happens, unfortunately, all the time in our area and across our country. Your disappearance became like a national headline, right? And like you said, other custody cases don't get such scrutiny and attention the way that yours has.
You don't see cameras in custody.
Why? What do you
stuff.
think it is about you that has garnered so much attention?
What do you think?
I
I don't know.
I don't know either.
Yeah, I don't know.
It's kind of stunning. It's interesting, in fact, the way media covered this. I know why we covered it, right? Because you are a Reading mom, right? And we covered the Chico Reading area and the surrounding 6 counties. I have no idea why national networks were getting in on the, chase. But I think it probably changed the outcome for you quite a bit.
It did.
What started out as probably what seemed like a positive thing, the whole country wants to find this woman, has led to insane consequences. Yeah. Or just maybe an impact would be the better word to use. It really impacted the outcome that we see today.
Right. And I wish that there was more coverage for more cases, because what happened to me, it had an impact on it during captivity. And I think that there's more victims out there that could benefit quite a lot if we gave them more attention and gave them more ability to talk about it in the media in the way that mine was.
So right now you are actively fighting to get custody back. That's your goal, that's your focus right now, right, in life?
Yeah.
Would you say that kind of is part of why you've decided to just open up and make sure that people understand your story, or what else kind of sparked this 9 years later for you to decide this is the time?
It's really just about participating now. Everyone's ran with my story about me without me, and now I have the courage and I have the ability to have a voice. So I'm taking my life back. It was incredibly humiliating to watch a Lifetime movie of myself come out while I was in prison. And it's like there's so many things that are deeply flawed, and the only way that I'm going to make any corrections to any narrative is to come out and use my voice. And I'm just not afraid anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, you're not intimidating to me anymore. You've been incredibly kind, and I found that to be very true. Not all media is created equal, as you know. We even have some outlets up here that we constantly have issues with reporting untrue facts and things like that. But they're going to continue to do that if I don't speak up. And I think everybody has the capacity to have the courage to speak up. And I do now. I'm not afraid anymore. And I have a deep relationship to the childhood trauma that I experienced. And I was a flawed person. I never claimed to have been a perfect person. But I have a different relationship to that now. And taking back the ownership of my life and being able to speak on my behalf instead of everyone else speaking for me has been a really, it's been wonderful. It's been a really lovely experience for me. It's been very healing.
You brought up some of the traumas from childhood a couple of times. We haven't dug into that very much, and there was another childhood thing I wanted to ask you about as well, which was the blogs that Keith's documentary mentioned,
Yeah.
where there were some, I guess you could say, allegations made by those filmmakers and by Keith or by investigators were looking into maybe something that when you were in high school that you wrote that seemed like it was racist. Can you just explain to me, from your perspective, what that was actually all about?
It's such an embarrassing story, frankly. You know, we've all come across mean girl situations, right? And way back when the story broke, when that first came out, I had my very first husband, my ex-husband came out and said, no, I was there. This was a mean girl situation. So he's one of very few people that were actually there present at the time when that came out. And I was a lookout for a roommate of mine who was cheating on her fiance at the time. I was like the person that took her to go cheat. And then I developed a relationship with that person. And because I did that, she used my computer in my bedroom to create this blog to harm me and to try and get me to lose my job at the time. And it forever lives on the internet. But I didn't write it.
Okay. Another thing that, a lot of people wonder about was that day, that Thanksgiving day that you were released, essentially, right? What was the thing? You talk about negotiating for your release. How did you convince him?
I think it was a myriad of choices. I think it was a lot. You know, there was a lot of trying to negotiate the entire time. And I would say the media attention was a very primary factor, but also him knowing the level of fear, knowing that I wasn't going to come forward. He knew that I couldn't tell Keith. I mean, Keith goes at great length in interrogation videos to say it's more important to him to understand if I was having an affair, and even going as to the length with law enforcement of saying, when you find out, do I get to know, or are you going to tell me right away? And so James was very predatory in that way. He knew that he was safe. He knew that I wasn't going to tell Keith, and I was never going to come out and say that I was having an emotional affair. And so he preyed on that.
Right.
And he knew, I continued to say, you know, they're getting close. They're going to find you. They're never going to stop looking for me, because it kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And I think that was something that helped set me free, you know, and I continued to bargain with him and promise him that I wouldn't come forward. And so I think there was a lot of factors that played into that. And frankly, I think there should be a more thorough investigation in asking James those questions.
Do you have any idea, if you don't mind talking a little bit about some of the horrific damage, essentially, that was done to you physically?
Right.
And his story was that you asked him to do it, to corroborate your story of, okay, I was abducted. I know investigators said, well, oh, look on her Pinterest, she does wood burning, and that's something that you've done before, crafting, right? And he says, oh, she told me to go buy tools. What is your take on all of that?
Well, I think it's similar to if someone was murdered with a baseball bat, you would go out and arrest everybody that plays baseball, right? So I had had a conversation with James prior to my abduction that I used wood burning tools. You know, we'd had discussions. We'd been on the phone at times that I had done wood burning crafts. So he was very familiar with the tool that I had used. And it's sad. It was something that I used to do that I can't even touch anymore. I didn't ask him to purchase that tool. I certainly didn't ask him to go to Hobby Lobby to purchase that particular tool to harm me. It's something that he was fascinated by. He's fixated on mutilating people's body to create certain things. You know, he wanted to create a tattoo that would keloid. That was something that he was very fascinated by. And I think that was a tool in which he knew that he could create that with.
Do you have any idea what exodus means?
No, and that's, you know, something that there's a lot of emphasis on as well. I don't think it's biblical. I think that it's in some connection in some other way with James, and I think it's a combination of things. But if I had to make a presumption, he's not religious. And in fact, when we tried to research it, it doesn't make sense, that particular quote in the Bible, or
Yeah.
verse in the Bible, rather.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So you don't know.
No.
Yeah, it would just be speculation.
Right.
Okay.
And I didn't ask him to do it.
Yeah.
And I didn't even know what it meant until long after I had returned home.
Yeah.
I just knew that it was letter by letter and how painful it was, and the sensation of how painful it was. I didn't want to know what it said, and it wasn't until almost over a year that I even looked into what it would say.
Okay. At what point, as you were getting closer to being released, to the point where you were interviewed by law enforcement and you came up with the story of what you could remember what happened to you, like, was there a time when you decided, oh, I've got to make up a story, I can't let Keith know the truth, that I was having an emotional affair? Did it just kind of come out? Like, you know how sometimes you say like a lie and, oh gosh, why did I do it? Well, now I got to commit. Like, how did that all go down in your mind?
I was desperate. I was desperate. And it was like first of all, I was still high in the hospital when I was interrogated.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't law enforcement that was interrogating me. It was my husband. So instead of Detective Kyle Wallace coming into the room, I just wanted to go home.
Mm-hmm.
That's all I wanted. And James had already pre-programmed me to not engage with law enforcement. And so they pulled Keith aside and they fixed him with some kind of recording device to interrogate me. So it's like I'm facing the person that I'm the most terrified of, and now I need to tell him what actually happened in a moment of distress. And then it was broadcasted everywhere. So I was up against so many odds and stuck between a rock and a hard place. And I have so much regret for not having the courage to just be able to face him and tell the truth. But I was just too afraid. And then you see what happened. I mean, it got completely blown up around the world. It wasn't just like it stayed locally in Shasta County.
Yeah.
It went everywhere. And so where do you go from there? You already know that you're lying to law enforcement. You know that it's a crime to lie to law enforcement. And at the end of the day, I have to go home with someone that doesn't care that I was harmed. He was only caring about whether I had an affair or not, and the image of the perfect life that we had. That was deeply flawed.
Did you ever feel like you could just step aside from Keith for a moment, right? Once you had been freed and you were home, and speak with somebody within the Shasta County Sheriff's Office, just one-on-one, and say, listen, this is my situation. And when I tell you this, I'm afraid I won't be able to go home.
No.
Why didn't you feel safe?
How would I have gotten there?
Yeah.
There's no way. I would have had to go through Keith. I mean, Keith had my car keys, for goodness sakes. He would have been the one that would have driven me there. So no, there was no ability to even have a secret conversation with law enforcement. I wish that there would have been. And in that last interrogation, I mean, you see them say, would you like him to leave the room? Mm-hmm. And I have to answer that while he's sitting next to me.
Right.
And then see him outside the window, and then also go home with him afterwards. I mean, this is why when there's house calls that women don't tell the truth when law enforcement come, because they leave.
Yeah.
They leave and there's no protection. And frankly, when I asked for a lawyer, that's when they should have stopped, and they didn't. Mm-hmm. I asked for a lawyer 2 times, and it should have stopped right then and there, and it never did. I was in between a rock and a hard place. I didn't know where to turn. And they start the investigation, that last interrogation, where they say, we know that you were lying, and lying to an officer is a crime. So I was terrified. Mm-hmm. I was shut down, and I was scared, and I knew that I had been lying, and I didn't know what to do. And frankly, should have had a lawyer helping me through that entire time. And what you see is 3 very aggressive men, no women, and no advocate, which I had the entire time, and no access to a lawyer.
And you're saying that Keith had a relationship with at least one of those investigators, like a prior relationship?
I mean, they played softball together. I don't know the manner in which they had an engagement prior. Mm-hmm. I can make presumptions of it, sure.
But do you feel like they took his side over your side from the beginning?
I think it's about missing it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't necessarily think it's about taking sides. I think when you have a lead FBI agent who doesn't have children and doesn't have a marriage and doesn't understand domestic abuse, I think that there's a part that was missing. And when you have another investigator who is a dude's dude and has a relationship outside of an interrogation room with my husband, and in fact, Keith has a lot of friends in law enforcement in Reading, I think that there was just something missing. I don't necessarily think that it was taking a side. I think there was a whole chunk of it missing.
Yeah, okay. You are a mom, and you're a resident of the city of Shingletown right now, right? And community of Shasta County. And that's what you want to continue to be, right? This is your home. Your parents live here. Your kids are here. So who are you right now when you're not in the courtroom or in front of the camera or on a podcast?
Yeah. I mean, I'm preparing for getting my kids back. You know, I'm making my home welcoming and inviting and redecorating their bedrooms and making everything ready for their arrival, and deeply rooted in engaging with my family. You know, I go to a local church there in Shingletown and do as much community events as I can. And I'm writing too. I'm writing a lot and trying to find my way back into the community.
So if you were to just only read things on the news or social media, you would think, whoa, Sherri Papini must have a hard time living in this world, right? Like going to the grocery store, people would just recognize you and have something to say. Do you feel like that's a little bit disproportionate, though, just based on social media? Like, do you feel like people in our community just treat you like a person?
Oh, they're incredibly kind. Like I said, our community is amazing, and the people that live here are incredible. And no, the people in Shasta County are loving and kind. There's curiosity, sure, and there are people that are curious about things, but no, everybody's really lovely here.
Yeah. It's interesting. I know you don't want to get into the legal aspect of your living situation, but I did find it to be mind-blowing that I think it was like the Daily Mail covered the fact that you were dating the owner of some car company, like as if it was People magazine and like a tabloid. And
it's so bizarre.
Yeah.
It's so bizarre.
Yeah. How do you navigate that? How do you, because you are, what you do is suddenly newsworthy because people are so interested in your story, but that's not what you want, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's obnoxious and it's disturbing. It's very disturbing to have cameras in a custody arrangement, in a custody trial, rather. It's very strange to see how much fascination there is. Like, I'm not a celebrity. You know, I was thrust into this portion of my life without my permission. It's not something that I ever would have imagined would be my life. It's still deeply uncomfortable. But I just try to live as normal as I can, you know, and if something pops up in the news, then, I mean, sorry, I'm just living my life as best as I can, really.
And now you're writing, or you've completed writing a book about your experience. Tell me a little bit about that. What made you decide to do it?
Well, in these films that are created about me, right, there's an editing process that happens. There's a manipulation that happens. I think that's one of the reasons I was so excited to come on here, because you said it's kind of podcast format. There's not a whole lot of editing.
Yes.
We just kind of go with an interview, right?
Right.
That's not the case in so many other things that have been created about me. And my book is a series of events and stories in my life that were deeply impactful and very profound to my life, and I think demonstrate who I am as a person. And it was so healing for me, you know, to be able to talk about some very deeply impactful parts of my life. And I think that there's a lot that in my vulnerability that a lot of other women and even men that are going to get a lot out of it.
Do you ever feel concerned that James or Keith or anybody who is essentially, if everything that you're telling me right now is true, there are people who should be in prison, right? But because they're not being prosecuted right now, are you ever afraid that you're going to get back into a legal battle and be sued for, you know, for libel or anything like that?
Well, you can't be sued for telling the truth. And I've learned the hardest lesson that anyone could possibly learn, and that means with my particular charge, I have to back things up. So from here on out, especially when I'm in front of a camera, anything that I say is backed up by evidence. Even trying to speak with you before we did this interview and telling you, you know, even my manager, and providing evidence for you and things that, you know, you have access to now. Everything that I say can be backed up. And that's so important for me. And now moving forward, if I say something, it means it can be thoroughly backed up. So
Yeah.
I'm not afraid. And in fact, it would be pretty incredible to have him in a courtroom because he'd have to answer to what he did to my body. And he would have to answer to some of the things that he said in his interrogation that just don't add up.
Right.
Like the injury to my nose, the way that he describes the injury to my nose, you can't physically replicate that. It's a complete out lie. And so if he were to, for example, try to litigate and bring me to court, I would get that opportunity to tell the truth, and I would get the opportunity to provide all the evidence that I have that concludes what I'm saying is accurate and true, and he can't.
Okay. And to be clear, you're not saying that what you pleaded guilty to, you're not going back on that at all. You feel good about the fact, I guess, essentially, that you pleaded guilty to lying to a federal agent. That's what it was, right? And
Yes.
mail fraud for accepting the help for what you went through. So that's not in question, right?
Well, I wanted to take accountability.
Yeah.
And so, when I decided to sign the plea agreement, I was instructed by my counsel that that was the best option for me. Because going in and seeking counsel, I told him that I wanted to take accountability. I was done lying. I didn't want to lie anymore. And in order to do that, that meant pleading guilty. And not pleading guilty and saying that I was innocent, that meant going to a very lengthy trial. And the trial would not be me versus James Reyes. It was Sherri Papini versus the United States federal government. It's quite intimidating. And I wouldn't get a trial where it would be me versus James, for example, where I could provide all of this evidence that would show that there was culpability on his behalf, that would demonstrate that there was no consent. But that's not who I was up against. I'm up against the FBI, and we know how powerful the FBI is, and a trial would not only be lengthy, but it would completely drain me of my assets, it would completely drain me of my time, and at the very end, I still lied. So at the very end of a very lengthy trial where I'm up against the entire United States of America, I still lied, and I still wanted to demonstrate my remorse by taking accountability and serving my time, which I did.
Okay. Well, you served your time. You still have to pay a lot of money, right?
Yeah.
How are you managing that?
Every bit of everything that I get goes to them. So I was recently awarded nearly $10,000 in my separation of assets and dissolution of my marriage, and I gave all of that to the government. So I pay them monthly at the moment. Whatever I can afford, and any time that I get anything extra, I'm giving to them. There's theories out there that I'm getting paid right now. You're not paying me to be here.
That's correct.
So I'm not getting paid. I wasn't paid for the documentary. I'm doing the best that I can to continue to survive. And what I would like to see is I'd like to see in the future being able to have a civil suit to attach some of the restitution to the people that are culpable in this crime. They should have at very minimum caught a conspiracy charge because they impeded an investigation and have no responsibility for that. And I think that
Who specifically?
James and
James.
the other family members that were engaged
Right.
in, because they admitted that they knew.
Yeah.
They admitted that they knew. And because I took accountability, it all falls on my shoulders. And it's difficult for me to continue. I'm in a bind, right? So I'm sitting here and telling you I'm taking accountability and I'm demonstrating remorse. But by me saying there's other people involved, it's being taken as I'm just blaming someone else. And so I'm in quite a bind in terms of how do I come forward and how do I communicate in saying I was deeply afraid and I am still a victim of a crime, but I take accountability for lying. It's a very sticky situation, and it's wrapped up in a lot of ego, and it's wrapped up in a lot of people that are deeply wounded by what happened still. And I'm trying to confront that in the best way that I can and doing the best demonstration and the best communication that I can surrounding that.
Okay. Is there anything else that you just want people here at home to know about you, about the future, about what's next?
Well, I think the future for me, I want to give back. I'm really enthusiastic about giving back to the community and getting more deeply involved in it. And in fact, giving back to those that are incarcerated now, looking into things like ARC, Anti-Recidivism Coalition, and things like that, and working with other community coalitions and things like that. I would love to do that, and I'm trying very much so to get more involved and give back in every way that I can, because I learned some very, very valuable lessons and some very hard ones as well. But I'm not disposable, and I just want to move forward with my life, and I think I'm doing that the best that I can.
And for the sake of, with your family, it seems like the situation with Keith, it seems incredibly difficult to navigate, to say the least. Are you hoping, though, that you can get to a place where things are amicable for the sake of sharing children together, or is that just way out the window?
I continue to try to be amicable. I mean, I've done everything that's been asked of me, even as going as far as having psychological evaluations. So I've had 3 psychological evaluations done, and they've all concluded that, I'm not a narcissist, and I'm not a sociopath, and I'm not a danger to my children. But I've tried. I mean, I've continued to try. I would love if, he could take some co-parenting classes, or maybe reach out to some of our very many community resources that we have that kind of teach you how to navigate through co-parenting, because there's a stagnation that's happening there. And when you have another parent that's just not willing to co-parent in any way, generally what you see is a very forceful flip in custody in family court generally.
If I had been through what you went through, I think I would feel just absolute outrage, right? If everything that you've told me today is exactly what happened, and that somebody held me against my will and harmed me like this, I mean, I would feel just like fury and rage and anger at people who doubted me and the people who did this to me. And you have a lot of composure, and you seem apologetic for your part in what you did wrong. I mean, how do you have that state of mind?
Well, I've been doing this for a decade now, and prison has really changed me in a lot of different ways. And frankly, now I have a lot more courage than I did before, and I have the capacity to use my voice, and I am. And I think that's what you're seeing here. I'm not screaming and yelling, but there is a lot of outrage. I'm not actually asking anyone to believe me, per se. I'm simply just filling in the gaps that were always there that never made sense. Mm-hmm. Now it makes a lot more sense. We all want everything to fit in a linear fashion, start to finish, and make it very clear. And life is so much more messy than that. But now that we have all of the pieces, it does make a lot more sense. And it is deeply unsettling that he is still free and has not taken any accountability for anything that he's done. It's very infuriating, and quite frankly, he is very dangerous.
So is there anything else that I didn't ask you about that you want people to know?
I think I'm deeply affected by how wounded people are by this case still. It's very personal to a lot of our community members here. And when there was worrying in vain, and for people to think that I did it all to myself, I mean, I was in real danger, and their worrying was not in vain, and it was deeply felt during captivity. And when James very cruelly talked to me about it, it's one of the things that kept me going, knowing that I had somewhere to go home to still, and knowing that there were people that deeply cared about me and deeply cared about my family.
Okay. All right, Sherri, thank you so much for being here today. Okay. Thanks for listening today. I decided to offer this podcast after enough of you let me know that you wanted a deeper dive into certain stories than you get on our TV broadcasts. We elect certain people to represent our voice, but who are they really? My hope is that this podcast answers that question. I love your feedback, and I want to know who you'd like to hear from next. Just fill out that comment section and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or Spotify.